So I want to give us two images tonight, and then you're going to discuss it, because I think, and I know John Cox agrees with this, because sort of where John started was in a very appropriate and good place to start, but I want to drop back a little bit further and think about sort of how the gospel is foundational to how we think about marriage. So I'm not reading the scriptures because they're actually too long, but two stories in the Bible, and the first one is God's covenant with Abraham. So God made a covenant with Abraham in the Old Testament. You can go read about it. And what he promised him is that even though he was without children, if Abraham would look in the sky and think about Abraham's time, there's no power. There are just a few fires, on the Great Plains. He said, look up, Abraham, and count the stars in the sky. Now that we have the Hubble telescope, we know that God meant something crazy. He says, you're going to have that many descendants if you'll trust me. And Abraham said, well, how can that be since my wife is barren? And he gives him this promise of a son through his wife. But that night, something happens, and God actually, it's called cutting a covenant. He cuts a covenant with Abraham. What they did is, this is how they did contracts during the Old Testament. They took a large animal, a medium animal, and two smaller animals, and they cut them in half. And they laid the animals, so here's the cow was cut in half. Here's the goat is cut in half. Here's the lamb is cut in half. And here's the dove is cut in half. And then each party would say what their responsibilities were. So if you were a widget salesman in that day, you'd stand on your end, and you'd say, I promise to deliver 400 widgets a month to you. And then you would walk through the split animals. And what that represented was, if I don't deliver 400 widgets, may my reputation and may my life be split apart. I'm yours. I'll be destroyed. The other person would say, I promise to pay you 67 sheep a month for the 400 widgets. And then they would walk through the cut animals. And that was how they created a covenant, how they created a contract that bound them together in anything and in business. And on this night, God came down and told Abraham to cut the animals. And Abraham cut the 4 animals. And he made a covenant with him, and he said, before you walked through Abraham, he put Abraham in a sleep. He made Abraham, now Abraham could see what was happening. It was probably more of a trance. And this pot of fire came down, which was the very image of God, and God walked through the pieces. And what God said that night is, Abraham, if you don't have descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sands on the seashore, may I be destroyed. And so what's interesting about that story is, this is God's preaching of the gospel to Abraham. He says, I, God, will keep my promise to you, Abraham, but I'm actually not going to ask you to keep your promise to me, because I already know you can't do that. So that later you realize what happens on the cross of Jesus Christ is that he's torn apart, he's destroyed, he's killed in every way. And he keeps the covenant that Abraham cannot keep and that we cannot keep. And this image is brought into the New Testament around books like Revelation or Ephesians, and it's talked about as marriage. And one of the ways that Christians understand marriage is that we understand it differently, for instance, than it simply being attractional or being, we're great, we go together well. We understand that at the heart of marriage is a covenant promise that I will lay down my life for you and you will lay down your life for me. And we'll come back to that in a second. So this idea of how the cross came to exist is at the very center of the way Christians think about marriage. But there's a second, more interesting story, and I'll do a series on it sometime. It's the Book of Hosea. And Hosea is a prophet of God, a man of great integrity, a godly man, a man who fears God. He's the kind of man we would want any of us to be. And God is going to use him to preach to the Israelite nation about their unfaithfulness. And so this is what he tells Hosea to do. Go marry a prostitute. He doesn't mean go marry a woman who has struggled in college and then came to Christ at 22. That's not what he means. He doesn't mean this is a woman who, had 4 or 5 lovers. This is a woman who sells her body for money. And the way she makes a living is she offers her body up to men and women alike simply for cash. And he doesn't tell Hosea, interestingly enough, hey, go marry her, first preach to her and make sure she's converted. He just says, I want you to go find her and marry her. And the story of Hosea is of her being unable to be faithful to her husband. Over and over again, she returns to the brothel and she sells her body for money. And in essence, as you read the book, she never stops being a prostitute. She never stops being an immoral woman. What's interesting about this image, and I'm going to tease them out for your discussion tonight, is that God is saying to his people, and think about Revelation, it's the bride of Christ meets Christ. The body of Christ is the bride of Christ. God is saying, you are a whore, and I'm a faithful husband. And the way I relate to you, my people, is that I'm the faithful one, and you're the unfaithful one. And if you're tracking it all with my very well put together but short presentation, his faithfulness to the covenant is showing up in his faithfulness to a people who will no longer worship him, who will no longer follow him, who will no longer obey him. God is remaining faithful in the presence of unfaithfulness. Now, these are the two foundational images upon which we build an idea of marriage as a Christian. And no one gets married in churches anymore, which makes me happy. It means I get to do a lot less. I'm serious. There's great preachers at all these sites that'll get you married, and I don't have to ride out there and have bad chicken the night before and hear all your friends tell bad jokes about you and then stand there and sweat while you get married. But it would be an honor to do it, I promise you. Just an absolute revelation and honor to do it. But what we understand marriage to be is two people come and they make a covenant with each other based on gospel truth, based on biblical truth. And in the nature of marriage is that I didn't ask Marissa to come and to satisfy me, to make me happy, to complete me, to rub my feet. No, I promised her I would die for her. So see, marriage in our culture is fundamentally reversed. Fundamentally. We are in a culture of devouring the other person. We're saying, I need you to complete me. I think more importantly, I need you to make me happy. I need you to be for me what I can't be. I need for you to help me solve my childhood wounds. I need you to do this, and if you don't do this, then you're not a good partner. And I'll just go find another person who can't do it, and then I'll go find another person who can't do it. We can use words like, and these are wonderful words, like compatibility. We can talk about being attracted to one another, which are good and helpful things. I hope that you're compatible and hope that you're attracted to one another, but because you're a man and a woman, you aren't. You just aren't compatible. And I'll leave the second one alone for right now. And so, what remains of a marriage when the things that the world tells us we need are gone? And what the Christian answer to that is, what remains is a covenant and a promise that we made in front of God and in front of our friends that said, we will be faithful to one another even when it hurts. I mean, you said it quickly, or you rewrote your vows. If you do come and ask me to your wedding, I will not let you rewrite your vows. I will write them for you, and you won't like them, but they'll be awesome. And at some point you will say, for better or for worse, I am your husband. When we can't have sex because you're sick, I am your husband. When we can't have sex because we had too many kids, I'm your husband. When I'm injured and can no longer provide for you, my family, I'm your wife. And we don't get that follow me, from shame and willpower and just, we get it from the gospel. Because Jesus Christ stood at the cross and he wanted a bride and he said, she's unfaithful. In fact, she's a whore. And she is the one who's going to put me on the cross. And I'm going to say to her anyway, I forgive you. I'll pay for you. And I said this last week, but I really want this sort of to be the kind of the centerpiece of your discussion. When you decided to get married, you decided to pay for that other person. The reason you got married is you hoped they would pay for you. Because that's what the world has taught you to think about marriage. Every television show, every movie, every sort of theme says you'll find somebody who will complete you. Somebody who will make you what you want to be. And I think Marissa and I would tell you in our most honest moments, we have just found someone who loves our socks off, who's really good at pointing out our problems, one to the other. What my marriage does is highlight my inadequacies, not help me solve them. My wife is one thing, it goes both ways. I'm saying that both ways. And I think that any of us, if we're brutally honest in this culture, and we need to be, is that the idea of being attracted to somebody for 60 years physically in the same way you were when you're 22 is ludicrous. It's absolutely ludicrous. It's nowhere in Scripture. It's not the way he did it. And the image that he gives us is of marrying a prostitute. So let me just dive into it. A prostitute has sexually transmitted diseases. I want you to go and marry an unclean woman who will make you unclean. And I want you to bear that. I'm not saying that about women here today. I'm just saying when partners come together, what they bring to each other is uncleanness. And the way marriage really works is you bear the other's weaknesses. You bear the other's inadequacies. Both of you together simultaneously. In your worst fights, you're both going, I'm just going to have to forgive them for this bleep, 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 right? And the other person's thinking that at the same moment that you're both losing the argument in the den, right? Because foundationally, the gospel says someone has to forgive and someone has to pay. And in good marriages, it's both. But I really appreciate what John Cox said. If it's only one person, it'll still work. If it's only you, it can still work. God honors that. And as you sit here and think about your marriage on this last night together, I really want you to think about and go back and think about what you really did in that glorious ceremony, that wonderful day that put your family in so much debt. You don't know that last $50 when your father passed away at age 99 on his credit card was the end of paying for your wedding. You don't know that he paid for it for 77 years. You don't know that. But what you really did that day was you made a promise the way God makes to his people. If you think about Ephesians 5, where he says all this language that everybody gets torqued up about, men, love your wives the way Christ loved the church and gave himself up for women, submit to, everybody gets torqued up about the submission language. If you step back and see the big picture, the small picture is beautiful. Here's what he's saying. The clearest image your children will ever have of what the gospel is your marriage. And your children will know it's hard, by the way. They already know it's hard at 6. You hear them say things like, Daddy is really angry tonight. Mama is tired. We've heard the children one time close the door and say, they're about to fight. Click. As they went to the basement to the Polly Pockets and Joy and Happiness, while Marissa and I squared off, pulled out our bowls of shames and got busy getting married. Sling, slam, bam. Your marriage has 0 chance of lasting unless at the base of it is a gospel covenantal understanding of life and your desire to forgive your spouse. All of you think this, you won't admit it because you're Christians. If if by some unfortunate chance they passed away, it would be easier. No, it isn't. Study the divorce rates on second marriages. They're stunningly higher than first marriages. Because what you discover in your second marriage are the exact same realities you had in your first marriage. You're a sinner, and they're a sinner. And only gospel obedience built on a covenant understanding of marriage will last. Anything else, if they've got to be attractive, if I've got to be attractive past the age of 37, it's over for Marissa. Much less 55. If I've got to be compatible with a woman, it's over. I'm not. If she has to be compatible with me, like we rejoice in my marriage that we have she is a thrifter, so she goes thrifting in all of the thrift stores and is gone for like 4 or 5 hours, and I go to a golf course. We rejoice in that time apart because we know we're not compatible. And if you ask us to do 24 hours in any home together, bad stuff happens. We know that because that's the reality of what it means to be a sinner. So what I'd like you to talk about in this last night and what the questions are is how these images of God saying, look, I forgive my wife no matter what she does, right? And the way I saved you was covenant promises. I'm going to do one little caveat. I decided to do it at the end and not the beginning. It's possible, this is a pretty small group, that some of you may have physical violence in your homes. And it can work both ways, believe it or not. Women hitting men, men hitting women. So I want to be very clear that if there's physical violence in your home, you should leave your home. Absolutely. You should not remain in the presence of physical violence in your home. There's also other types of things, emotional violence and psychological violence, and I understand that. So I just want to say, if you feel tonight that you are trapped in a physically violent home, we would love to meet with you in secret and talk about it. So when I talk about forgiveness, and when I talk about grace and mercy, I'm not backing off on that, but there are occasions where things like physical violence and real abuse are taking place, and you should not remain in that. And we would be glad to walk with you, men or women, through that. So I just want the person who thinks, the pastor just told me I have to forgive for being hit. That's not what I'm saying. There's a proper way that we, as your brothers and sisters, can come alongside you and help you walk in and through that, and even out of that. But if the problem is just that you and your wife are normal, then you're going to need massive forgiveness and massive grace built on a real understanding of covenant to survive. Talk among yourselves. So Chad's number is up on the screen, has been for a few minutes. We've got about 15 minutes left, and I hope that was helpful discussion for everybody involved. And now let's see if you have any questions. Chad is always good about making up the first one or asking me one from his table, probably. If you and everybody has a family text thread, right? Ours is called Stoner Clan. And if it's not these days being cluttered with TikToks, I'm not sure you're happy. Only 4 people got that joke. We're in so much trouble. I know. Any questions, Chad? You got one? Come on, come up with a question. Marissa, you got a question? You don't have to have one. You don't. No pressure. It's good to know that y'all are just so forgiving and merciful. You can't wait to give up your life for somebody else. I mean, I'm glad to. No questions. I see somebody texting. When's coming? You can just ask me. He sent it. Did he come to you?
All right, here we go.
This did not come from him.
This is not from it, no. All right, somebody asked, are there any other reasons other than violence, infidelity, to break the covenant of marriage?
Historically, the church has worked hard to define 3 reasons that they believe Scripture teaches for divorce. One is adultery, sexual infidelity. The second one is clearly violence. That's often been put under the rubric of abandonment, but abandonment would be the third. Abandonment can be a bit misused because abandonment historically meant your spouse literally disappeared like a UFO, like took them. It meant, and this happened a lot more in days gone by where a husband or wife in a small town just disappeared to the next small town, never to be seen again. And at some point, you were allowed to divorce them. It can happen in war where someone disappears in war, where they've blown up. What I would say that's important is, and I think, again, I really want to emphasize that the presence of physical violence and abuse must be fled, and that's different than divorcing in that moment, must be fled. But adultery and violence and abandonment can be overcome, and some people have overcome it and some people don't. But what I would want to say to people is, someone who can overcome that and someone who can't, there's no difference. It's not like the person is somehow more spiritual if they were able to forgive the infidelity in their marriage and the next person isn't. And there's also degrees of this. I think I'm not going to dive down this rabbit hole. The presence of pornography in now a lot of men and women's lives, it's about 35% of the women now in our culture look regularly at pornography, is not the same thing as adultery. It is horrible. It is sinful. It is terrible. It's not the same thing as adultery. And so, you really got to be careful when you enter into that. But again, I'd go back to the point. You're going to have to forgive your spouse. I hope you don't have to give them for adultery. I really do. But you're going to have to forgive them at some point. And that's part of what's here. But it is a legitimate thing to see marriages end at times and to see people go into a second marriage. If you're a bunch of college students, what I'd say at this point is there's not just one person for you. And my church is proof of that. I bet that this church has about 40 people whose spouses passed away and they married someone else. And that means there was 2 persons for that one person. So don't walk around college campus going, there's one for me. There might be 85 for you. You just got to find one of the 85.
And with that, all right, next question. John, words are important in what we call things and how to refer to each other. So obviously, we shouldn't lay it on too thick with the she completes me or he's my everything language, because that can set an unrealistic expectation. But how far to the other side should we go? Wouldn't us constantly referring to our marriage as a mess or referring to our marriage like a process start to weigh on our negative outlook?
Yeah, okay, so that's a great question. All of the questions are good. You should not walk around and go, my marriage is a mess. Because it scares the crud out of the rest of us, right? Like, we don't want to go to dinner with you anymore because we're like, they talked about their marriage being a mess the whole time. I had a friend, we confronted him, we're like, he's like, I don't know, we love each other. We're like, well, you need to talk about that. Marriage is so romanticized on the one hand and has become so casual on the other that Christians have to talk about the real essence of marriage, which is forgiveness. But in some sense, Marissa absolutely completes me. In some ways, Marissa and I are compatible. In some ways, Marissa and I, we're absolutely made for each other, and we have many moments of delight and joy and happiness. There's no better person in the world to entertain with than Marissa. I mean, I really mean that. She's an amazing entertainer. There's probably very few people she's probably in the top 5% of merciful people. Just don't share your feelings with her, but she'll be merciful if you just won't share your feelings with her. So there's so many ways. It's just that in a conference like this, people are often, especially in their 30s and 40s, experiencing like, this doesn't feel like it's working. it's that second kid often that's the tipping point for so many people. Like, this isn't working. In some sense, if you get in a marriage conference, you're trying to help people walk into that moment of going, we never go on a date. His and her breath is always bad. They snore. I don't sleep. I don't like the way they cook. Have you seen the way they drive? We don't like the same TV shows. He wants to go to the gym. I want to go for, you're sort of 37 and 11 years in this on third kid, and you're like, why did we do this? So I just want to, and I just would remind you of the you that John told us. And many of you are in the you. Marissa and I are on the other side of the you. The other side of the you is awesome. Let me just invite you to grandeur. But you should talk both ways about your marriage. You should be able to say, let me tell you about the great things that I see in my spouse and the great ways I feel attracted to him or her and why this is beautiful. But I think as young couples come into this, and this will be great, and you watch TV shows, you have to caution people that this is a collision of two sinners and not the creation of this sort of myopic, beautiful, happy place where we all get happy. Hope that was a good answer.
All right. Pastor, do you have suggestions for how do you come to peace with your parents' broken marriage? So, for example, my parents had a Christian marriage where one was unhappy but believed in the covenant and stayed, but it wasn't enough. And as a child, all you could see was the hurt and the pain and somebody staying with someone while the other one wasn't holding up their side of the covenant.
I really wish I could have avoided that question. So whoever's asking the question, I'm going to give you a good answer and a John Stone answer. So first, a good answer. So the good answer is that's really unfortunate, and that's really true in a lot of marriages where one person's very committed, the other person is very distant. And I've even done counseling where I've wondered, why does the person stay? It makes no sense that this person is even here. They just ought to move out. And it can be really hard, and when that happens, what happens to children is the children become the missing spouse. So if your parents went through a divorce or your parents had a really hard marriage, what either your dad or mom did to you is they sort of turned you into they had so many needs. They turned to their children and put those needs on the children. They're not aware of it. It wasn't malicious. And I think that anybody and you see this especially in young couples, especially young men in America, can't make the decision to get married anymore. It's just this horrific cycle of dating girls, and her ankles are too fat, and she had 2 necklaces, and these are all excuses for, I watched my parents' marriage fall apart, and I'm scared to do it. That's what it is. And if you're going to get married, you actually have to do it by faith. You just do. Faith in Jesus Christ and faith in the gospel. And I just would say to you, and there is a time and I've canceled people like, y'all need to move out. Like, you're not present. It's not, we're talking about over 15, 20 years. Not over 15 hard months when they took a new job or had a baby or have postpartum depression. These are real things. And so I just think you have to be careful not to let the unhappiness of that marriage come into you. Now, here's the John Stone answer. It's also possible that parent was lying through their teeth to you. And it's never occurred to you that your mama lied to you. That your husband, that your dad was really a great dad, and he did everything, and she was just miserable and depressed and loved making people suffer. So I don't know how to interpret your question, because it could be either way. And here's what's always true. One sounds right until the other comes forward. I can tell you as a pastor, that is the number one verse invisibly written over my doorway. When people come to see me and they tell me stories, I think, I can't wait to hear the other side. And sometimes they're exactly right. Most times, it just gets way more complicated. Just way more complicated. It's not about, and I would just say to you, be careful as a child interpreting your parents' marriage. You don't know. You just don't. And unfortunately, you'll find out when they die and you read their diary and you have to sit down and weep and go, I was completely wrong. My dad was a hero. My mom was a villain. And I made her the hero and him the... Like, that happens. That's okay. But, like, you don't know as a child that your dad was a workaholic because it was simply very hard, and he was the one committed to the marriage more than the one telling you they were committed to the marriage. So that's the John Stone answer. I don't know which way it goes. It can definitely be both, but it could be either or.
All right. You talked about ways to give the other one space. Are there suggestions from a Christian perspective? Any resources? How can you help with understanding giving the other one space?
I don't know about resources. That's a great question. Maybe, Chad, you'll know resources. I don't know. But I think you have to recognize in a marriage that you have to work very hard to be together, and you have to be okay with being apart, and you also have to be okay with interpreting experiences differently. Let me say the last one. You have to be really okay in a marriage with interpreting experiences differently. You don't have to be on the same page. So Marissa and I would not be on exactly, we're close, the same page about what moving to Tucson, Arizona meant for us. So for her, it meant the loss of the ability to drive and see her children. She had 3 daughters. She always wanted to be a mom. And when we moved, she couldn't drive. She could drive to see them there and could get to them. One of them lived in town with us. And so moving to Tucson, from her experience, and it's more complicated than that because I had been fired and I had a couple of part-time jobs, and she got in the home. And here's another one. The home we were in, she loved, and I loathed. And that's the right, like, I loathed that house. Loved every memory, every corner, every Christmas tree, but loathed it. And we're just not going to have the same answer. And so in public, when people say, how's Tucson been? We're going to give you 2 answers. I and she have to be okay with the other one's answer, right? It was far more redemptive for me to become a lead pastor professionally. And we also empty nested when we moved out here, like this strange occurrence happened. So it's okay. Marissa's loved it out here. She I can feel her want me to say, it's fantastic. She loves it. I'm just saying that you have to be okay, working hard to be together and working hard to be apart sometimes, but also having different experiences. You can't interpret your spouse's introversion or need to have hobbies different from you as anything other than normal. Now, I understand that the husband who works 85 hours a week and plays golf on Saturday and Sunday, he is a problem. Hear me say that. That husband is a problem. And I'm on your side, wife, on this one. But in the same way, I'm on the husband's side for a wife whose total investment is in her kids, and he's just being dragged along to help with her mission of raising perfect kids. I'm on his side on this, right? So it can go both ways, but you know, Marissa does not want me normally to go thrifting with her, and I'll tell you why. I actually, shopping. No. She does it faster, more efficiently, and with deep anger. Not anger at you or me, just like it's a mission, and we got to find deals, and I'm like, hey, let's look at this. She's like that, like our marriage doesn't work. But it works in so many other ways. But I don't want her to go walk on a golf course with me. I'm doing some, you know what I'm doing on a golf course is in a job that has very few definable limits. I get a number. I'm serious. There's a number at the end of every round that I can measure and I can rest in. And in ministry, you don't have that. So you have to work hard to let your spouse have hobbies, and you ought to encourage it, especially husbands. If your wife is sort of trapped in this kid zone, and she's got 3 great kids, and this is all she ever wanted, but she's trapped, and she hasn't done anything fun for her. You got to really work hard to help her do that. But it doesn't always have to be together. And there's always one in each marriage who is more comfortable not being together all the time and one who wants a little more. That's just the incompatibility problem, and you got to work through it. Like, what's the right way to balance that? Chad?
I hated that last part you just said.
Sorry.
So this is flipping the script a little bit. This is someone who's single. I can't get past what you just said. I'm the one who always wants a little bit more. Spend time with me. All right. How do we look for someone who can help bear in looking for a potential spouse? how do we look for somebody who can help bear our burdens and someone whose burdens I or we can bear? In other words, in searching for a partner, how do we get past a cultural narrative to be honest about our brokenness? Because you obviously can't walk up to somebody and be like, hey, I'm a mess. How are you?
I don't think there is a very effective way to really know a person you're marrying in the way that question's being asked, and it's a really good question. It's a really good, fair question. Just a couple things I would advise against. We met, and 4 weeks later we're married. I really advise against that. A lot of people do it. It happens and it works, but it creates problems. I think that I think one of the ways I can answer that helpfully is people are more often doing pre-engagement counseling. And it's good to go in and say, I'd like a safe place to talk about why marriage scares me. So I'm scared about marriage because my parents got a divorce and it was the most painful thing I ever went through. And it's helpful even we've been dating 8-9 months. Let's go talk about this. Because and the other person can say, I'm afraid of your fear. I'm really afraid of it. And that doesn't always have to be with a professional counselor. Good pastors can do that. So I think that you can explore that. So even though you don't absolutely walk up to somebody and go, I'm a mess. How's your mess? You certainly do need to think about that there's a mess over there you haven't seen yet, and there's a mess over here they haven't seen yet. And that there should be some exploring of that and honesty about that. The number one thing you bring into your marriage is whatever you think about your marriage, your home origin. So, my sister-in-law Polly passed away, which is unfortunate, but I will say this. She said to me one time, it never occurred to me that I wouldn't spend Christmas in my parents' home every Christmas for my entire life. And she was a woman who thought she'd get married, so she had thought about that, right? Marriage. It didn't occur to her that she'd spend half of her Christmases at home. And so that was a lot of discussion for my brother and her. She was a wreck. They got married, I think, December 4th and came to my parents' home, December 23rd, and it was funny for me. It was awesome. She was miserable. God was doing a powerful work of grace in her life, and she hated every moment of it. Those are, if your parents fought out loud, you expect to fight out loud. If your parents fought quietly, you expect, all that stuff, oh, he's cute, she's cute. We don't want to admit this, but they kiss great. We liked The Notebook together. We liked long walks in the park, and we liked 70s music. This is it. None of that's relevant. So this is what I'd say if I was doing a singles conference. Here's the difficulty with being married. Every single thing you're afraid of before you get married, the moment you say I do, goes away. And everything you didn't think about, you're now afraid of after you get married. It just is in your face. And I can't get anybody over that. You're like, he, she, I'm telling you, I do. It's gone. And there's a whole nother set of dynamics there called budgeting and birth control and in-laws. The worst thing I ever had to do in my life that didn't involve something super serious was tell my mother that if she called Marissa again after I had told my mom we couldn't come that weekend, and my mom asked Marissa if we could come, and Marissa, not knowing my mom had talked to me and saying we would come, I said, you will not be allowed to talk to my family ever again. No, I'm serious. Because I had to leave my family of origin. Marissa did nothing wrong in those conversations, but my mom was manipulative. I have a great mom, but she's human. And she wanted the grandchildren that live 5 hours away to be in town essentially every weekend. No. Chad, one more question.
Yeah. Pastor, these 4 weeks have been great. How will the church, or how is CFC going to continue to help marriages after this is over?
I don't know. I mean, sit under the preaching of the word. Make friends in your community group. Talk about your marriage in community group. Go watch the videos again. We'll post them on the page on the website. We're going to have John Cox back, but next year he's going to talk about parenting in the spring, which he's actually a little bit better at. His first book was on parenting, and we'll do other conferences. But so it's everything has to come to an end. You're like, but we didn't really love the talking, John. It was the food and the babysitting we loved. We're totally aware of that. And so, yeah, but let me say the best thing you can do for your marriage, even if it's great, is find an older couple, just talk to them. You need a referee. Like, just to have someone that says, hey, I really hear where you're coming from, John, but you can't say that to Marissa. That comment is unrealistic, and vice versa. Marissa, what John felt, you didn't feel bad. Like, you need a referee. A referee is what gets you through life, because you get tired and emotional and you just start blowing through all these boundaries that are normal. And it's just helpful to go sit in with somebody and go, can we tell you about the fight we had about buying new tires for the car? And anybody who's interested is like, I'm all in on that because I know what you weren't fighting about, and that was buying new tires for the car. I'm real interested in what the ignition point for the tire fight was, right? That'll be fascinating. So you really need to not do marriage alone. You just don't. You can't. I mean, the thing lost in our world, and there's actually some positives, is you used to grow up in smaller towns and smaller communities in big towns where everybody heard you fight through the walls, and so men would come around and say, hey, son, you can't do that. Or the moms would gather in the square and say, oh, that was a terrible decision. Why don't we think about it? And that's really lost. We have to move around. We're outside a community. So finding some people to talk to your marriage about and finding someone where you say, would you just help us fight? Just help us fight. We need help because the way we fight's ineffective and it doesn't end will be really some good advice. So I did tell Heather we would go late tonight, and that's fine. So it would be great here at 7:08 if you grab those kids up before 7:22. John, why did you pick 22? Because you won't forget that number. Let me pray for us. Father, we thank you that you're married to us, that we're the bride of Christ, and he even now is washing us with his word and preparing us to marry him. And we thank you that when you look at us, you see a whore who you're deeply in love with and who you will not give up on and who you continue to pursue. Give us that vision of the gospel, of our groom dying for us on the cross, that we might die for our spouse. Give us people to help us walk in marriage. Give us people to help us fight in marriage. Give us joy in the journey. Give us beautiful moments of tenderness and gratitude. Lord, and give us patience. You're patient with us. We need to be patient with one another. Help us, Jesus, we pray for your name's sake. Amen. Thank y'all so much.
All together